Hello there, today I'm here to bring you my June wrap up. Now I'm not gonna lie, this is gonna be the shortest wrap up I have done since having this channel, I think, so it's pretty bad. I've already spoken enough about how bad my reading's gone this month, but in my defence I was on holiday for a week and I literally was getting to read 10 pages a day at most while I was away, and also I have moved house, etc, etc, so reading has just completely fallen by the wayside this month. So I'm hoping to let this month behind me and move forward and have a much better reading month next month. I feel I should mention Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. I was reading that while I was on holiday. I'm about 300 pages through that, but it's a 900-page book. After I was still stuck on that one 2 weeks into the month, I thought I was just going to put that to the wayside and actually start reading some books I could finish, otherwise I wouldn't have had anything to talk to you guys about. So that was kind of where a lot of my reading went. I've also started sort of rereading The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I've got about 100 pages into that one, so that's 400 pages right there. So that's where a lot of my reading this month has gone. But in terms of books I have finished, I have really only completed my challenges. The first book I read was The Glorious Heresies by Lisa McInerney. This was the winner for the Bailey's Prize last year, and it was also my library pick for the month. I was very excited to see this in the library because it wasn't a book that interested me enough to actually pick it up, but I wanted to read it anyway because it won the Baileys and I've heard nothing but good things about it. For me, I am glad that I didn't get a copy of this and I picked it out from the library. Now that said, I did enjoy it. I really enjoyed the process of reading it. It's such a fast-paced read. But for me, it was much more mainstream, I suppose, than I was expecting. I was kind of expecting it to be a bit more literary and a bit more standoutish maybe, purely because it won the Baileys. But for me, this is very much a sort of mass appeal book. So it's set in Ireland and it is looking at the sort of gang culture in Ireland, and the head gang man is called JP, and his mum put him up for adoption when she was younger, but she has just come back and he's put her up in a flat and she kills an intruder who enters that flat, and it sort of goes from there. Not really about JP and his mum, they are just the factors that get the storyline going. What the story really focuses on is the man that JP gets in to hide the body of the person that his mum killed, and we look at that guy's family and especially his son Ryan and his experience with his girlfriend, and also his experience growing up in this situation in Ireland. His dad is an alcoholic. He obviously grows up in a situation where sort of gang culture and gang violence are all around him. There's drugs everywhere, and we kind of just look at how all this has an effect on him and who he becomes from growing up with all of this. I would say if you like The Casual Vacancy by J.K. Rowling, you will really enjoy this. I think the themes and certainly the way things come together, it very much reminded me of The Casual Vacancy in the way that nobody in this book is pure or good. Everybody does bad things. But what really is touching about the story and what really hits home is the influence that all this bad behaviour and all this meddling and messing around has on the younger generation, and ultimately they're the ones who suffer from everything that their parents are doing. I really liked the character of Ryan, and I think the second one in this series goes on to look at him further, but he was a very well developed character in the fact that he was flawed and he's far from perfect. He does some awful things, especially as he's growing up. He becomes not a very pleasant person, but you love him anyway. There's this really deep, I don't know whether it's because we meet him when he's very young, you develop this real sense of maternal instinct towards him. He's such a sweet, lovely boy underneath all of the rubbish that he does, and yeah, he's just a really good character. So he's who really pushed this book through for me. But as I say, it was a lot more mainstream than I was expecting, and I'm sure for a lot of people that's going to be a good thing. It is, as I say, a page turner. It's so easy to read and it's really fast paced and plot heavy, but that's not necessarily my kind of thing, I'm afraid, sadly. I don't know if I will pick up the next one just because I really did love the character of Ryan, but we shall see. Then I read The Doll's Alphabet by Camilla Gradova. This was my short story collection for the month, and it came from the moth box that Mercedes at Mercedes Bookish Musings runs. I'm sorry to say that I gave this a 2-star. I really strongly disliked this book. Now, I don't know whether that was where I was at with my reading. I think by this point in the month I was just completely disillusioned with books and I wasn't really in the mood to even be reading, but I forced myself anyway. And I think when you do that, you often have a more negative experience with a book than you would have. But looking through some of the other reviews, because I did look through them before I rated this because I didn't want to be overtly harsh, the other reviews pretty much said the same thing as what I was feeling, so I think it's more a reflection of the collection than maybe my mood at the time. It's difficult because when I say I gave this 2 stars, and this is the first 2-star read I've had in about 3 years, it kind of makes it sound like it's a really awful book, and it's not an awful book. But for me, it just, it wasn't my kind of thing. Like, I do love magical realism in short stories, but this was kind of magical realism that I couldn't get behind. And I've spoken before about the different types of magical realism, and I quite like magical realism that's kind of metaphorical and not so much fantastical, so more based in the real world and just sort of a metaphor come to life almost. That's what I enjoy. This was kind of magical realism for the sake of magical realism, I felt a lot of the time. In my opinion and what I enjoy, you can't just have a magical realism story that has no real point to it, and I felt like that's what happened with these stories. I think she tried to be as odd, outlandish and bizarre as she could, but there was no underlying reason for it a lot of the time. And to a certain extent, I did think that that was my own fault in that I wasn't properly paying attention to what I was reading. But as I say, a lot of the other reviews said the same thing. I think the problem is you can't write a collection that's completely out there and not let your readers in at all on what you're actually trying to do. So there were just stories in here that made absolutely no sense. In fact, the majority of them made no sense to me. I think that is a flaw of Camilla Gridova's. I think felt like her writing just needs quite a bit of polishing. Now, I don't know, I think this might be her first collection, I don't know. But it very much read that these are all kind of stories that were half thought through and that maybe could have all actually come together to create one story rather than to create a collection of stories. So there are a few themes that we come back to time and time again. There are a lot of sewing machines in here. In fact, I think most of the stories had a sewing machine in. For one, the sewing machine thing kind of went over my head. There was a story that I enjoyed, the first story called Unraveling, where a woman unravels herself instead of sewing, obviously like women want to do. She unravels herself. I liked that concept, and it's actually similar to a story I've written in the past. And there was also a story I enjoyed which was kind of like a film I like, which is a world in which women had to have a man, and the men went out and did these tests, and the women, basically their life goal was to find a man who they could spend their lives with, and that was really good. But other than that, literally, I did not enjoy the stories in this collection. I'm sorry, Mercedes. It may be for you if you like really outlandishly bizarre magical realism with no real metaphorical meaning behind it, but for me it just fell a bit short. That said, I would still recommend the Moth Box. It's definitely worth doing, and it was interesting to read this anyway. It sounded like something I would enjoy, but it just fell short for me. Then I read The Lonely City by Olivia Lang. Now, this couldn't have been more of a different experience. I have done an individual review of this, which I will link down below. This was a 5-star for me, one of the few 5-star reads I've had this year. It was my non-fiction for the month, and it was so good. So I'll only talk about this briefly. As I say, I have done the full review if you want to check that out instead. But this looks at Olivia Lang's experience with loneliness, and her own experience has led her to look at the way that artists in the past have expressed this feeling of loneliness, how artists have used art to reach out to the world. And it also looks at the psychology behind loneliness. It looks at experiments that have been done that look into the subject of loneliness. In short, it is just fantastic. It is definitely a good one for fans of Just Kids by Patti Smith, and I will love this book eternally. I think it's one that I'm going to come back to for sure. Then I finished the month with We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. This was my YA pick for the month. I have to say I wanted to hate this. Every part of me wanted to hate this because there's so much hype about it, and it kind of, I had shunned it in my head into the John Green category. And let's not even go into how much I dislike John Green books. However, when I started reading this, I did have the experience that I was expecting, but then something happens and the writing kind of changes from there, and I really actually quite enjoyed this. Now, I wouldn't say it's an amazing favourite read ever, but for a YA book it's definitely not bad, and I gave it 4 stars, which is probably one of the highest scores that I've given to the YA reads I've had this year. That said, I'm still going to give it away. I don't intend to read it again. It's not going to go down in my history books. As I say, it was a lot better than I was expecting it to be. So it's kind of a difficult one to speak about because it is kind of a twisted narrative where the narrator isn't quite sure what's going on, and also there's a big secret that she doesn't know about that we don't know about until the end. So it's difficult to talk about, but basically I think I can say more than some people have. Some people have said I'm not saying anything, it'll ruin it. I don't think that's the case. This is about a group of kids who have been born into a very rich family, and they go to their grandfather's island every summer and they spend the summer together. That is kind of the brief, what we get at the beginning. Then there was one year where things go a bit wrong and we know there's an accident, and from there we don't know what's happened. The accident happens to Cadence, our narrator, but she has amnesia and she can't remember what happened. So she starts trying to piece together her life, and it goes through what she experiences in the aftermath of the accident, and then she goes back to the island in an attempt to unravel what happened to her. So yes, that's the general premise, but obviously because she doesn't know what's happened, it's kind of, we get some unreliable narration going on, and she sort of isn't sure who's telling the truth and who's lying to her and things like that. What I would say about this is that because of that unreliable aspect, it's kind of a case where we don't really learn that much about the other characters around Cadence, and I think that's a real shame. But I can also understand why that happened, because at the end of the day she doesn't know what's happened, and going into more about the characters would have kind of unravelled things that we didn't want to know until the end. So I can see why it happened, but it's a bit of a shame because it kind of made the other characters a bit flatline. But that said, there's literally, that's not E. Lockhart's fault. I don't think there's any way around that. But what I feel about this is that it would be really good for people who are interested in going into literary fiction but don't want to dive straight in, because obviously it is written for a YA audience, but it's kind of got hints of literary fiction in there. Sometimes the metaphors are a bit overdone, like Cadence often speaks about after the accident she gets these really bad migraines, and she speaks about them as a woman standing over her and putting a axe through her skull, and that kind of all got a bit barf. But other than that, it was well written and definitely on the literary side of things, and I would say definitely give it a go if you've been putting it off, because I was pleasantly surprised. So that is everything I have read this month. Not great, but we're moving on. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books and what you thought about them, and I'll see you next time, and hopefully my reading will pick up from here on in. Bye!